The first thing Compliance Director, Ezen Veth, said to me, in the formal reception corridor of Joint Observation Station Veth Orium, that he hoped I would find the accommodations adequate, given the constraints. I said I was sure I would. He said the human complement had been assigned Observation Ring C, which was, he wanted me to understand, a fully functional ring, not a secondary ring. Fully functional. It was simply positioned on the far side of the station from the primary administrative hub, and it was true that the ambient temperature in Ring C ran approximately 4 degrees cooler than the rest of the station. He understood humans found less than optimal, but the adjustment had been logged as a low-priority maintenance item and would be addressed in the next quarterly cycle. I said that sounded fine. He paused. The Vithani are built like something a very organized mind would design if it needed, to carry a great deal of paperwork simultaneously. 4 arms, bilateral upper and lower, with the upper pair used almost entirely for expression and emphasis rather than manual labor. Ezen Veth arranged his upper 2 in what I had already learned, from 11 months of preparation materials, and Dr. Hamasaki's annotated recordings was the Vethani expression of polite skepticism. Elbows out, wrists rotated inward. The gesture said roughly, maintaining courtesy. But I find your equanimity implausible. He said the human complement was, of course, welcome to raise any comfort concerns through the formal liaison channel, which processed requests on a 12-day review cycle. I said I'd keep that in mind. He said he was sure finding the station's primary operations both instructive and, he trusted, somewhat humbling, not in any pejorative sense. Simply that the Vithani Compliance Directorate had been operating joint observation programs for 140 years. There was, he said, quite a great deal to absorb. I said I was looking forward to it. He arranged his upper arms again. Then he said, and this was the thing that would be said, with small variations, approximately twice a week for the next 3 weeks, that the Directorate had been somewhat surprised by the size of the human complement, 7 personnel, for a joint station of 82. He wanted me to know that the Directorate bore no judgment about this. Resource constraints were real. Planetary programs often struggled to staff interstellar exchanges at full parity. The Vithani had operated with reduced delegations themselves in their early years. He delivered this last part with the particular magnanimity of someone describing a developmental stage that a younger species would, in time. I said 7 was what we had sent. He waited as though expecting me to elaborate, to explain the number, contextualize it, offer some wistfulness. When I didn't, he made a small sound that wasn't quite a word, more like the Vithani equivalent of clearing one's throat, and led me down the corridor toward Ring C. I should explain what the Vethani Compliance Directorate actually was, because most people who haven't dealt with them tend to read the name as something ominous. It isn't. It's accurate. The Vithani are, in the most fundamental sense, auditors, not of finances, of civilizations. They travel, they observe, they assess, they file reports. They have been doing this for 140 years, and they are, by any honest accounting, very good at it. They are also, as a culture, deeply proud of how good they are at it. They express this pride through a form of elaborate professional courtesy that, priests, once you understand its grammar, reads quite clearly as condescension. The key is that they don't intend it as condescension. They intend it as education. They are the people in any room with the most experience, and they treat this as a fact of the natural order, the way a very experienced surgeon treats the gap between their knowledge and a student's, as something to bridge with patients. There is no malice in it. It is simply the attitude of people who have been right about things in writing, with documentation, for 140 years, and who have not yet had occasion to discover whether they are right about everything. They had been observing Earth for 31 years by the time the joint station was established, 31 years of patient surveillance. From a research platform in our outer system, cataloging our technological development, social organization, our resource practices, our conflict cycles, our recovery rates, our institutional evolution, their report on humanity. I read the unredacted version years later, when the diplomatic situation had matured sufficiently to make that appropriate, ran to 4,000 pages and concluded, in its executive summary, that we were a moderately interesting mid-development species with above-average resource extraction capacity and below-average long-range planning horizons, trending toward probable self-stabilization within 2 centuries. Assessment confidence 73%. Moderately interesting. I thought about that phrase a good deal during my 3 weeks on Veth Orium. 4,000 pages of work and 31 years of observation, and the conclusion they led with was moderately interesting. Not uninteresting. That would imply indifference, and indifference doesn't sustain 4,000 pages. Not interesting. That would imply they were paying elevated attention. Moderately interesting. Worth watching, not especially worth worrying about. And the not especially worth worrying about part was carrying most of the weight. Our team settled into Ring C on the first evening, 7 of us. Myself as cultural attaché, which was the official designation on all the formal documents. Cressida Falk and Tomas Igwe, our technical observers. Both had the practical air of people who read specifications the way others read novels and find them equally absorbing. Dr. Yuki Hamasaki, our linguist, who had spent 11 years building her professional life around Vethani communication analysis, and was, at this point, in a state of sustained professional elation at being this close to primary sources. Ren Okoya, our logistics coordinator, who organized the stillness of someone who's worked in enough complex environments to understand that disorder is what happens to people who failed to plan adequately. Brant Leiss, our security consultant, who said very little, read a great deal, and was consistently attending to things that the rest of us were not specifically assigned to track. And Dr. Aysel Nurlanovna, our medical officer, spent the first 2 days systematically documenting every measurable way in which Ring C's environmental systems were running below the Directorate's own published standards for jointly occupied facilities. She was not documenting them because she intended to complain. She was documenting them because the data would be useful, and because she found the specific nature of each deficiency professionally interesting. Ring C was cold. The heat panels assigned to serve it were running at 2/3 capacity. One of the air recycling units had a cycling irregularity that dropped the temperature approximately 1 degree every 40 minutes before covering. Ren assessed the situation in the first 2 hours after arrival, organized a rotation for the functioning panels so that the workspace stayed at a workable temperature during our primary hours, and adjusted the sleep arrangement to account for the cycling. The problem was resolved before the first evening's work session. We wore our thermal liners, made tea in quantity, and Ring C became a simple operational fact that we worked around. We did not file a maintenance request. The formal sessions began on day 2. The Directorate's main deliberation chamber was warm, noticeably so, after Ring C, and large and precisely organized with the kind of precision that rooms deploy when they want to communicate institutional authority without having to say so. High ceilings with bioluminescent panels in ranked rows of diminishing brightness, most intense over the Directorate's long table, and somewhat less over the guest table, positioned at a perpendicular angle to it. The arrangement was certainly deliberate, and pointing it out would have accomplished nothing worth the cost, so I didn't. 3 walls were lined floor to ceiling with physical archives. Sealed cases of a dark composite material, each labeled, carrying the slightly dry and slightly sharp smell that Dr. Hamasa identified as the synthetic resin adhesive the Vethani had used for their archive bindings for 3 centuries. The Vethani maintain physical archives as a foundational institutional principle. A record worth keeping, their maxim goes, is worth keeping in a form that does not require power to read. They are the only civilization I have worked with that maintains 3 simultaneous archive formats for every document: physical, secured electronic, and a compressed encoded summary object that functions as a permanent durable abstract. They call this redundant permanence. I thought of it as the philosophy of people who have watched enough other civilizations lose their institutional memory to regard that loss as a lamentable failure of character. Azan Veth chaired each session with 2 deputies. Kethian Saul, who managed the recording apparatus and documentation exchange and who I came to understand was considerably more senior than the recording function suggested. The Vithani do not assign experienced people to ceremonial roles. The person who controls what goes into the record is never a minor figure. And Avris Dan, who sat at the far end of the table and, during the first 2 weeks, said almost nothing. Dr. Hamasaki had explained, in the preparation months before departure, the Vithani signal seniority through economy of speech. The older and more authoritative a professional, the less they say in formal settings. Avristan was, by her estimate, among the 3 or 4 most senior people in the entire directorate structure, and he was present at our sessions because someone at a high level had concluded that the first human joint program warranted the attention of someone who would know what to notice. On the first day, Ezan Veth walked us through the structure of the program with thorough, carefully calibrated clarity, a genuine orientation designed to be useful rather than perfunctory. He covered the session schedule, documentation protocols, formal address conventions, and what he described as the Directorate's general expectations for productive program engagement. He noted, with what I recognized as sincere rather than performed care, that given the early stage of formal human Vithani contact, the Directorate had taken particular pains to design this program with appropriate scaffolding to help the human delegation acclimate to their working methods. Scaffolding, that word specifically, a structure provided temporarily to something under construction, meant to be removed once the structure is stable enough to stand without it. Cressida wrote something in her notebook. I thanked Ezenveth for the orientation and asked whether session documentation would be distributed in advance of each session or following it. He said, following, as was standard directorate practice. I asked whether an accommodation could be made to receive it in advance instead, as our team found preparation before discussion more effective than review after the fact. He paused, upper arms out, inward, and said that was not standard practice, but an accommodation could be made in recognition of the particular circumstances. I thanked him. He looked at me for a moment with his large amber eyes. The Vithani don't blink at anything close to the rate humans unconsciously expect, which creates a persistent impression of being attended to with more focus than you anticipated. Then he moved on to the agenda. The sessions in the first week covered the Directorate's foundational methodology, how they identified and selected observation targets, how they calibrated assessment criteria for species at different developmental stages, how they weighted different categories of evidence, how they constructed confidence intervals, how they structured reports for accuracy and longevity. It was substantive and well presented. Ezan Veth explained it with the easy fluency of someone who has refined an explanation over many years of presenting it. He also found, in every single session without exception, at least one moment to note the size of the human complement, sometimes directly, a reference to how the previous joint delegation, the Soriv, a species of 6-limbed mathematicians with impeccable professional instincts, had sent 22 personnel, had engaged with a particular methodological question, sometimes indirectly, a gentle observation about how session formats had been adjusted to accommodate a smaller group, or how delegation size correlated with the breadth of cross-disciplinary discussion. In the 6th session, after a detailed treatment of confidence interval methodology, he observed that smaller delegations, while sometimes operating at what he characterized as a documentation disadvantage, often developed compensating strengths, including what he was prepared to call, with appropriate caveats, a kind of intensity of attention. He meant this sincerely. I received it sincerely. In our Ring C debrief that evening, Cressida showed me her notebook. She had been keeping a running tally of every complement size reference, session number, topic under discussion, which directorate member had made it, and register, matter of fact or magnanimous. The second column was running longer than the first. She said she found it professionally interesting. I said that was thorough of her. She gave me the level look of someone who knows exactly what she is doing and doesn't require acknowledgement, and we moved on to the day's actual work. The first week also had an incident that I had not anticipated, which turned out to be informative. On day 5, during a session on data collection methodology, Tomas asked a specific technical question: how the directorate recalibrated their confidence intervals. When a subject species underwent rapid technological change within a short observation window, it was a careful question phrased as a practical clarification, nothing aggressive about it. As Anveth paused, more noticeably than his usual processing pause, and then said that calibration methodology was addressed in the Directorate's published technical standards, copies of which had been included in the pre-program documentation. He said this with complete courtesy. It had the precise quality of a door being politely closed. Kethy and Saul made a brief notation in the session record. Toss said he had reviewed the published standards and they described a recalibration trigger at each new developmental stage, but he was curious about the practical implementation, specifically whether current programs had undergone recent recalibration and on what schedule. As Anveth said that operational details of current programs were generally outside the scope of the Joint Program Exchange, accuracy and confidentiality reasons, and he hoped Tomas understood. Tomas said, of course, completely, and did not raise the topic again in open session. In Ring C that evening, he told me the answer was in the data regardless. The standards required recalibration at each developmental stage. The Directorate had been running concurrent programs for 40-plus years without the overhead of recalibrating each one. The mathematics were not complicated. He didn't need the Director's confirmation. The deflection itself was, he noted, data. It told him where the gap was, and that the Directorate was aware enough of it to deflect rather than address. I said the deflection had been very informative. He agreed and wrote it into his notes. The second week brought the shift I had been expecting. The sessions loosened. The prefacing hedges as Anveth had used in week 1. The "this may be somewhat technical," the "I should note this involves specialized terminology," mostly disappeared. He was presenting now at full depth, without pausing to check whether we were following. They had formed their assessment of the delegation and were operating from it. Earnest students, attentive and focused, working hard to absorb a substantial program. They were not wrong that we were working hard. And arrived 3 minutes late to the afternoon session on day 10. He had been first in the room every session of the first week, seated and reviewing notes when the rest of us arrived. Dr. Hamasaki flagged the deviation that evening. It indicated, she said, that he had completed his own assessment of the sessions and concluded they were operating without unusual variables. It allowed himself the professional flexibility of not treating the afternoon session as elevated priority. He was right about the sessions. The work we were actually doing was happening in Ring C in the evenings, not in the deliberation chamber. On day 11, during the morning session, as Anveth presented a case study from the Directorate's historical program record, a species he called the Thurvi, a low-development civilization assessed 3 decades prior. He walked through the full methodology, surveillance phase, target justification, evidence gathering approach, confidence interval construction, final report structure. He said, at the end, that the Thurvi case was particularly instructive as an example of the Directorate's methods at a mature stage of their development, and that it illustrated the kind of careful, systematic work the joint program was intended to help us understand. What I noticed was that the Thurvi case study was being presented as a model to learn from. What Tomas noticed, which he shared with me that evening, was that the Thurvi case study was one of the clearest examples, in the Directorate's historical record, of the confidence interval problem. The assessment had been published at a point when the recalibration drift was minimal, but the Thurvi situation was not static. It had changed considerably in 30 years, and if the current methodology were applied to the current Thurvi picture, the confidence intervals would be off. Not catastrophically, but measurably. Anveth had held it up as a model of mature methodology. The irony of this was simply data. I noted it and moved on. Week 2 was also when Brandt came to me with a quiet observation. He had been tracking the information security environment around the stations, common areas and Ring C's corridor in his usual methodical way. He had noticed a pattern in the access logging, gaps at intervals too regular to be random degradation, consistent with an active oversight system rather than a malfunction. He said, "I think there may be monitoring on Ring C's corridor." I said yes, most likely. He waited. I said, The directorate had been observing species professionally for 140 years. It would be unusual if their standard protocols for joint program delegations did not include some level of monitoring of the delegation's non-session activity. They would want to know what we were doing in Ring C in the evenings. That was, in fact, what the directorate did. They watched things. He said that didn't concern me. I said not particularly. We were doing work we were authorized to do under the Charter's own language. If their monitoring had picked that up, then the ending conversation was simply going to be less of a surprise for them. If it hadn't, we would have that conversation anyway. Either way, conversation was coming. And the only response to the possibility of being, while you watched, while you work is to keep working correctly. He sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "You assumed there would be monitoring when we planned this." I said I had considered it probable. It seemed consistent with how the directorate operated. He thought about this and went back to his notes. I want to try to convey what the work of those 3 weeks actually required. Because from the outside, it does not look like much. It looks like people in a cold room taking notes and comparing them. The interior of it was different. It required a specific kind of sustained dual attention, engaging authentically with the sessions, genuinely, because performed attention is noticeably different from real attention, and we needed the genuine kind, while simultaneously conducting the secondary layer of analysis that the assessment required. Asking the questions of attentive students, while also being the questions of professionals, mapping a methodology from inside it. Dr. Hamasaki managed this with a fluency the rest of us did not match. She had been in this precise cognitive position for 11 years. For her, the double tracking was a practice skill. For the rest of us, it required more conscious effort. And by the evenings it produced a particular mental tiredness that Ren correctly identified early as the reason tea consumption was sustained at the level it was. To understand the shape of the work, it helps to understand who each person was and what they were actually doing in those sessions. Not the role on the official documents, but the live function. Tomas Igwe had come to us from a decade of industrial methodology auditing for interplanetary infrastructure programs, the kind of work that involves sitting in control rooms, watching how experienced operators actually run complex systems, rather than how the manual says to run them. He had over those years developed an eye for the gap between stated process and practice process that I have rarely seen in someone without another 30 years of experience behind it. He watched the directorate's technical presentations the way a diagnostician watches a patient walk across a room, not just for what was stated, but for the small involuntary signals that appear when a practiced professional encounters a question they would prefer to route around. When Ezanveth declined to discuss current program recalibration schedules in Day 5 session, Tomas noted the deflection, the way Kethian Sol's notational pace briefly increased, the precise phrasing Ezanveth had used, accuracy and confidentiality reasons, which was not the same as operational reasons, and the distinction was useful. He wrote these observations in his notes in a handwriting so small it was effectively private, even if read over his shoulder, which he assumed was possible. Cressida Falk was younger than Tomas by several years, and had arrived at her particular skill set through a different path, a long stint with an interplanetary standards body that was primarily responsible for harmonizing documentation and archival protocols across different member systems. She had spent the better part of a decade arguing, in patient technical detail, about the difference between what an archive claimed to contain and what it actually contained. She had learned, through this, that the physical artifact of documentation, how something was physically filed, in what format, with what index, what classification scheme, told you things about institutional priorities that the content of the documents themselves often obscured. The directorate's archive room, which she was permitted to observe from the guest table during sessions, and which she photographed with careful discretion during the break periods, was a monument to institutional confidence. Everything was there. Everything was organized. The classification scheme was consistent. The indexing was precise, and the coverage was comprehensive, for the periods when the directorate's methodology had been what it currently was. For the period before the current methodology had stabilized, approximately 40 years back, the indexing scheme changed, and the change was subtle enough that only someone specifically looking for it would notice that the older archives used different granularity of subject classification, one that had been, by current standards, somewhat coarser. Not wrong, coarser. First, the difference between a methodology that had been refined and one that had merely grown. Brant Lace said very little in the sessions and contributed very little to the Ring C debrief conversations in terms of quantity. What he contributed tended to change the shape of what we understood. He had a background I am not going to describe in detail because it's not my background to describe. Practical effect of it was that he had spent a long time being very interested in the ordinary behavior of people who believed they were not under observation, and he had become very good at not appearing to be observing. In the sessions, he appeared to be reading. He was reading. He was also watching. His notes, when he shared them in the Ring C debrief, tended to be about sequences and patterns, who looked at whom when, what the timing was between a question and the moment someone else in the room shifted posture, what the physical security posture of the station's common areas revealed, about what the directorate considered to be standard threat assumptions versus elevated risk. He noted, on day 8, that the access points to the directorate's archive rooms were monitored by equipment that was current and well-maintained, while the access monitoring for Ring C's corridor was, as he had told me, functioning inconsistently at regular intervals. He said this suggested the directorate's active security attention was concentrated on their own records rather than on watching visitors, which was interesting for what it implied about their prior experience of joint program delegations. Visitors, in the directorate's model, apparently not a significant security variable. They were students and observers, not actors with their own agenda. Dr. Hamasaki worked at a layer most of us could not fully access. She was monitoring in every session, not just what was said but the precise choices made in saying it, which vocabulary was selected, which constructions were used when they were optional, what the structural framing of each explanation implied about the speaker's assumptions regarding the audience. Also, formal professional communication is highly encoded, not deceptively, simply densely, in the way of any communication system that has had a century and a half to develop its conventions. And what she was doing was translating that density into its underlying assumptions. When Ezhan Veth described the human delegation as having intensity of attention as a compensating strength, Dr. Hamasaki noted in her records that the specific phrasing used was the same phrase the Vethani applied to observations conducted by non-specialist observers in field settings, people doing their best without the right tools. It was the kind of compliment you give to someone who has worked hard within their limitations. She noted this without comment in the debrief, setting it down as data, the way she set everything down. Ren was tracking things that appeared administrative and were not. The directorate staff allocation across concurrent programs, which she could partly infer from session scheduling, partly from the movement patterns she observed in common areas and corridors, partly from the administrative communications she was copied on as the delegation's official liaison point, told a story about institutional priorities. The Human Joint Program was being managed by the Directorate's internal allocation as a low to medium priority engagement, not dismissively low. They had assigned senior staff, including Avris Dan, which was significant. But the absolute number of Directorate staff hours being devoted to the program was modest compared to what their published efficiency and benchmarks would suggest for a first contact joint program with a new species. The implication was that the Directorate considered this program low risk, a first contact engagement with a moderately interesting mid-development species, early in the relationship, at a stage where nothing unexpected was likely to emerge. An orientation program for a small delegation from a civilization that was, by their 4,000-page report, not surprising. This was, on the face of it, a reasonable operational judgment. It was also exactly the kind of judgment that the confidence interval calibration problem made more dangerous over time. Ren noted all of this without expressing any opinion about it. She was a logistics coordinator. She kept track of resources and how they were used. The data would be in the report. In the Ring C debrief on the evening of day 12, we had a long session that Dr. Hamasaki afterward described as the point at which the report became clear rather than assembled. We had been accumulating observations for nearly 2 weeks, comparing them across our different angles of view, cross-referencing against the Charter and the Directorate's own published standards and the pre-program documentation. On day 12, picture resolved. The 4 findings had been visible for several days in individual domains. What became clear on day 12 was how they formed a coherent picture. Not 4 separate issues, but 4 aspects of a single underlying dynamic, which was that the Directorate was an institution, operating at excellent standards, for the conditions that had existed 40 years ago, in a galaxy that had since changed. Not in a dramatic way. The Vithani weren't wrong about the civilizations they had assessed. Their reports were accurate, their methodology was sound, but the margins were narrowing, and in a few places, the margins had already become smaller than the methodology's inherent tolerances. An institution that assessed other for a living, and had never been assessed itself, had no external mechanism for detecting this. That was not a failing. It was simply what happens to every institution, without exception, that operates for long enough without external review. The Directorate had been more insulated from this than most, because their work was largely uncontested. The civilizations they assessed were, generally not in a position to contest the assessments. And because their reputation was such that the quality of their work was broadly assumed, rather than periodically verified. The second finding, the Charter provision, the transparency gap, was, in the report structure, listed separately from the methodological ones, but it belonged to the same underlying picture. An institution that had written 140 years' worth of other civilizations' assessments had never had to think carefully about what it means to be on the receiving end of one. The Charter provision had been in the template for a century and a half because no one had ever had occasion to use it, and things that have no occasion to be used tend not to be examined. I wrote all of this in the evenings, in Ring C, with the heat panel at the end of the room, and the temperature cycling down and recovering every 40 minutes, and the sound of Brant reading and Ren organizing her files, and occasionally Dr. Hamasaki composing a sentence in Vithani under her breath to check a translation choice. I want to be clear about the character of the writing I was doing, because it matters to what the report was. It was not adversarial writing. It was not the writing of people who had come to find fault, or to demonstrate superiority, or to score a point. It was the writing of people who had been given a genuine opportunity to look carefully at an institution they respected, and who had looked carefully, and who were reporting what they found. The Directorate's competence and seriousness, and the genuine quality of their work, those things were in the report, in detail, in the executive summary, and in the introductory sections of each finding. Findings themselves were precise and specific and supported by evidence. The recommendations were actionable and consistent with the Directorate's own framework. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was minimized. If the Directorate had conducted this same assessment on a human institution of comparable age and scope, this is exactly the report they would have written. We had learned the form from them. It seemed appropriate to apply it. The 12th day of the 3rd week had a particular quality that I noticed at the time without fully understanding. The morning session was on cross-species comparison methodology. A detailed walk through how the Directorate approached the problem of comparing developmental metrics across civilizations with radically different biological and cultural substrates. It was genuinely interesting material. One of the areas where the Directorate's long experience had produced sophisticated methods that were not easy to arrive at from first principles, and Azan Veth presented it with a visible enthusiasm that I had not seen from him before in quite the same form. He was proud of this methodology. It was, he said, one of the aspects of the Directorate's work that he considered most significant. The attempt to maintain rigor while acknowledging the fundamental incommensurability of radically different civilizational forms. The session ran long, into what should have been recess. No one flagged the overrun. During the session at one point, Overstan said something. A single short phrase in formal register, directed at Ezanveth. A note of clarification or elaboration. It was brief enough that I could not catch the content without asking Dr. Hamasaki. I didn't do in the room. She told me afterward that it had been a technical correction, subtle and precisely aimed, clarification of a methodological timeline that Ezanveth had slightly compressed in his presentation. The correction was, she said, the kind of contribution you make when you know the material at a depth that allows you to hear when a summary has omitted a nuance. It was the most Avris Dan had said in 3 weeks. And it was. She said in the register of someone who was present and interested, not observing from a distance. She thought that significant. I thought that significant too. But I had the report to finish that evening, and I finished it, and it was what it needed to be. The third week had a different quality, easier, warmer, with the settled rhythm of routine and, within that routine, something that was genuinely collegial on both sides. The sessions ran long several times because the discussions were productive, and neither party flagged the overrun. Ezanveth's explanations had reached the register of professional exchange rather than instruction, sharing methodological thinking with people he considered by now to be engaged and capable, even if small in number. Kieth and Saul and Cressida were exchanging documentation shorthand at the end, sessions with the efficiency of people who have found a common professional language. Toss had developed an ongoing informal conversation with 2 of the directorate's junior technical staff about data visualization conventions across different civilizations, which both parties appeared to find genuinely interesting, and which had evolved into a comparison of analytical tools that I overheard producing actual productive insights. Ezanveth had learned that I drank tea during sessions and had arranged, from the first day of week 3, for a heated vessel to be placed at the guest table each morning without being asked. It was a small courtesy and a real one. I accepted it as such. The warmth in the deliberation chamber by then was genuine on both sides. The warmth, professional relationship that had developed over 3 weeks and had found, within the formal structure, something like mutual regard. Avris Dan arrived early to the afternoon sessions twice in the 3rd week. Dr. Hamasaki noted this. She said, it indicated he found something in the sessions that warranted more attention than a routine assessment had originally suggested. She had her hypotheses about what. She kept them to herself. The formal culminating session was on the 14th day of the 3rd week. Ezanveth delivered a summary address that was gracious and thorough, a real valediction, with genuine reflection behind it. He reviewed the program's scope, articulated what the directorate's intentions for our engagement had been, and said, in language that was formal but not empty, that hosting humanity's first delegation had been a genuine professional privilege. He observed that the quality of engagement throughout had been consistent, which I understood to mean the depth of our attention had been steady, throughout the program, without trailing off, which the directorate apparently found worth noting. He said he hoped we would carry home a useful foundation for understanding the directorate's work, and the standards to which it held itself. He noted, as he had noted before, that the compliment had been modest in size. He said it without edge. It was simply the fact that organized his understanding of the 3 weeks, the variable against which everything else was measured. He said he trusted we had found the program informative. I said we had found it very informative. He relaxed his upper arms in the Vethani open posture expression. Then he asked if there were any final matters to address before the program formally concluded. I said there was one small administrative item. He said of course and waited. I said that as the human delegation had been representing the Interagency Assessment Office, we had completed our formal institutional responsibilities under the program charter during the preceding 3 weeks, and would be transmitting our assessment documentation to the Directorate's home office prior to departure, consistent with standard practice. I asked whether he preferred to receive the routing confirmation directly or through the formal liaison channel. The pause was approximately 2 seconds. In 3 weeks of sessions, Ezanveth had not produced a 2-second unscheduled pause once. He was a professional of long experience. He processed and selected his words with measured precision, but the pauses were working pauses. the pauses of encountering something outside the model. This was different. Kethian Saul set down his recording stylus. Overstan sat forward. Ezenveth said, "Assessment documentation." I said yes, our program report. I wanted him to know it was a positive assessment overall, and I hoped he would find the specific recommendation constructive. He said, very carefully, "You have been conducting an assessment." I said yes, consistent with our institutional mandate as lodged in the program charter. I could reference the specific section if that would be helpful. He was quiet in the particular way of a very experienced professional who has encountered an unexpected variable and is doing the work of revising their model in real time with full composure in front of an audience. I had deep respect for that specific kind of quiet. Revising your understanding of 3 weeks of shared history in 2 or 3 seconds, without losing your register, without deflecting into defensiveness, that is a skill that most institutions do not instill, and most individuals do not acquire without considerable practice. He said he had not understood the human delegation's institutional designation to imply an active assessment function. I said I understood. The charter language was compact. I was happy to clarify, going forward, how the assessment office designation applied in practice. He said that would be appreciated. I said I also wanted to note, for the record, that the accommodations in Ring C had been entirely adequate. The temperature issue had resolved in the first afternoon without requiring a maintenance request. He looked at me with his large amber eyes for long enough to be meaningful and short enough to remain fully professional. I said the report was 37 pages, including appendices, and that I was happy to preview the 2 most significant findings before it reached the Home Office. I wanted him to have the context, not simply receive the document. He asked for the preview. The first finding concerned confidence interval calibration methodology. The Directorate's published standards required recalibration at each new developmental stage of a subject species, a provision that existed because methodology calibrated for a stable subject produces measurable bias when applied to a rapidly evolving one. In practice, the recalibration had not occurred in approximately 40 years. For the Directorate's more static subjects, this had produced no meaningful effect. Subjects with rapid adaptive capacity, species that changed their technological baseline significantly within a single generation, the resulting confidence intervals underestimated recent capability shifts by a calculable margin. Our technical observer had documented the specific instances and the variance involved, and the finding included a suggested recalibration approach consistent with the Directorate's existing methodological framework. Fix was not architecturally complex. It was a recalibration their own standards already required, which had been deferred for 4 decades without until recently, producing errors large enough to be noticed. Ezenveth was quiet for a moment, checking the finding against what he knew of their practice. When the internal confirmation came, and I could see when it did, because something in his expression settled rather than raised, he asked about the second finding. I said the second finding was that the Joint Program Charter, in its current form, created conditions in which a visiting delegation operating under an active assessment mandate could conduct that assessment without the host party's prior knowledge. This had happened because the relevant charter provision, the one establishing the visiting delegation's retained assessment rights, had been in the standard template for 140 years without ever being used, and had never therefore prompted the Directorate to consider its implications. I was recommending that the charter be revised to require both parties to explicitly disclose their institutional mandates and any active assessment functions at program commencement before the first session. This would serve the program's stated goal of mutual advancement considerably better than the current arrangement, and would be consistent with the transparency standards the Directorate itself applied to all of its professional work. The ventilation system cycled behind the archive shelves. In the quiet of the room, I heard it clearly. Ezenveth said, "You are recommending that we close the provision you used." I said I was recommending that the program operate on a foundation of complete mutual transparency. Yes. It seemed consistent with the values the Directorate had demonstrated throughout. He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I heard distinctly the slight click of an archive case responding to a pressure shift in the room, and the steady background of the ventilation, and Overst Dan's steady breathing at the far end of the table. Then Overst Dan spoke, his first complete sentence of the 3 weeks. Short, formal, in high register Vethani, the register reserved for statements intended for the institutional record rather than the transient conversation of the room. Dr. Hamasaki translated it for me afterward, carefully. The phrase was, "The delegation was thorough." It was said in exactly the tone a senior assessor uses when formally acknowledging a piece of work that professional standards. Not surprised, not grudging, not colored by any secondary register. Simply a fact stated for the record, in the appropriate format, because facts of that kind belonged in the archive. There was one more thing that happened in the 3rd week that I did not include in the report. Because it was not evidence of anything measurable, reports deal in the measurable. On the evening of day 16, I was in Ring C later than usual, finishing the penultimate section of the report, when Dr. Hamasaki came in from whatever she had been doing and sat down at the other end of the work table. She had a cup of tea that Ren must have made before turning in. She sat with it for a while without saying anything. I kept writing. After some time she said that she had had a conversation with Overst Dan during the afternoon recess. A brief one, 5 minutes, perhaps 6. He had approached her, which was unusual enough that she had noted it as the first unsolicited extended contact from a directorate member in 16 days. He had asked her, in high formal register, how long she had been studying Vethani communication. She said she had told him, 11 years. He had been quiet for a moment, and then asked whether she had found the study useful. She said she had. He had said, in a register that she described as slightly less formal than the first 2 exchanges, not casual, closer to the register of professional conversation between equals, that the directorate occasionally wondered how it appeared from outside, not the methodology, not the reports, not the formal face of the institution, simply how it appeared, whether the manner in which it conducted its work created the impression they intended to create. She had said carefully that she thought the directorate created a very clear impression of its institutional priorities. He had said, "That is what I thought," and then the recess had ended and they had returned to the session. Dr. Hamasaki told me this in Ring C on the evening of day 16, and then drank her tea, and then said she did not know precisely what to make of it. I said I thought he knew, that he had either picked up on something in the sessions, a pattern in our questions, quality in our attention, or he had been told by whoever was monitoring the Ring C corridor, or both, and that he had come to her because she was the one of us most fluent in the Vethani professional register, and he had used that register to say something that was not quite asking a question and not quite making a statement, but was in the territory between a senior official of a very confident institution quietly acknowledging, to a person he believed could hear the acknowledgement accurately, that the institution was aware it had blind spots, without stating what they were, without doing anything as formal as admitting a finding. She thought about this and said, "You think he knew about the report?" I said I thought it was possible he suspected. The monitoring, pattern of our sessions, the consistency of our preparation. If someone at that level was paying attention, and he had been paying attention, as Ovristan's timing patterns had told us all along, a person of his experience might put together enough of the picture to form a reasonable hypothesis without having confirmed it, she said, and he said nothing, I said, and he said nothing, which was, I thought, the most interesting part. She was quiet again for a while, then she said, "He trusted us to do it correctly." Thought about this for a moment, and said I thought that was probably right. Not trusted us to do it necessarily, trusted that if it was being done, it was being done correctly. Because the alternative interpretation, that an unknown thing was happening in the margins of a program his institution was running, and the response was to approach the most linguistically capable member of the visiting delegation and have a 5-minute conversation about institutional optics. The alternative interpretation was that he was either very naive or very confident, and Ovristan was neither of those things. Dr. Hamasaki sat with this for a moment and then said, I am going to include this in my monograph, I said. I expected she would. She finished her tea and went to bed. I finished the section I was writing and closed the file. The next morning, in the 15th day's session, the penultimate one before the culminating address, the material was dry and detailed, procedural cleanup, rather than new methodological ground. As Veth moved through it competently, the room had the settled quality of near completion, the slightly slower pace of a complex program approaching its formal end. At one point, Veth used, in the course of an explanation, the phrase moderately complex. He was describing the cross-species comparison framework, or calling it moderately complex as a characterization of its demands on a new user, distinct from a practitioner of long experience. It was a precise, functional use of the phrase. I noticed it in the way you notice something that connects to something else. Moderately interesting. Moderately complex. Not a category of dismissal. Exactly. A category of calibration. Here is this thing in relation to the spectrum of things we have seen, and it sits here, and this is an accurate description. The Vethani did not use imprecise language. If they said moderately, they meant moderately, and they meant it precisely, and the precision was a courtesy of a particular kind. The courtesy of not overstating, which they regarded as a form of accuracy that respected the subject. Humanity was moderately interesting in their 4,000-page report because, at the time it was written, with the methodology they had used to write it, that was an accurate description. Not an insult, an accurate description, the same accuracy they would apply to themselves, or try to. The report in my file was going to tell them that the methodology used to reach that had a measurable calibration problem when applied to rapidly evolving subjects, which meant that by their own standards of accuracy, the confidence interval on moderately interesting was wider than the report had indicated, which meant that if you adjusted for the calibration problem, humanity might still be moderately interesting, or it might be something else. The honest answer was, the current data, assessed correctly, would produce a number they had not yet calculated. Did not say any of this in the session. The session was about procedural cleanup. That evening I finished the report. The morning of the culminating session, before we walked to the deliberation chamber, Ren handed me a cup of tea, the new blend, the commemorative one, and said nothing. She had a quality, Ren, of making her silences feel chosen rather than empty. The cup was warm in my hands, and the tea was good, and Ring C was cold in its usual way, and in 4 hours we would be in the docking bay. I drank the tea. Then we went to the session. What happened in the session I have already described. What I want to add here at the end of this account is something about the quality of the silence in the deliberation chamber after Overstand spoke. His 4 words for the record, and then silence. And in that silence, the room held everything that had accumulated over 3 weeks. The sessions, the recesses, the documentation exchanges, the tea, the Thurvai case study, the Day 5 deflection, the conversation in the corridor with Dr. Saki, the monitoring that was and was not a secret. All of it in the room at once. Silence. That lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and then resolved into the ordinary procedurals of a program concluding. Insol picked up his stylus. Overstand settled back in his chair. Veth asked, in his precise professional voice, about the routing preference for the report confirmation. We sorted out the routing. We sorted out the departure logistics. We exchanged the formal closing courtesies. We shook hands. The Vethani have a specific formal physical contact convention for program conclusions that involves briefly pressing the upper set of palms together, and Veth and I performed it, and I thought it was the right note on which to end. That was the last thing that happened in the deliberation chamber. The departure was the following morning. Veth met us at the corridor to the docking ring. He was somewhat more formal than the warmth of the previous day's session would have suggested, and Dr. Hamasaki noted quietly, walking beside me, that he had added something she hadn't seen him use with us before. A slight forward inclination of the upper torso. She identified it as the Vethani professional gesture of acknowledged equivalence. Not deference, not concession, equivalence. The peer acknowledgement, one professional to another, that standing has been established by evidence. From a compliance director of the Vethani Compliance Directorate. After 140 years of institutional tradition, in the context of what had just occurred, it was not a small gesture. He said the directorate would review the report with the care they applied to all documentation received under formal program protocols. I said I was sure they would, he said, with the small pause of someone deciding whether to voice what has already formed. That he remained somewhat surprised that Snell had managed the scope of work the report implied. I said we had been focused. He said yes. He supposed that was one way to put it. I told him it had been a genuine pleasure working with the directorate. I meant this completely, because it had been, the report said so, in its first paragraph, before it reached any finding, and that paragraph had been the easiest to write because it was straightforwardly true. The Vethani Compliance Directorate was an excellent institution, doing serious work at a high standard. 140 years of sustained, disciplined, professional practice at a genuinely difficult task, done with real care for accuracy and real investment in doing it well. The findings didn't diminish any of that. Findings don't diminish the work they're set against. They give the subject specific, actionable ways to be even better at what they already do well. And the directorate, I was confident, knew the precise difference between that and criticism. They had been giving that kind of report to other civilizations for a century and a half. They knew what it felt like to receive one correctly. He said he was glad we had found the program informative. I said we had found it very informative. We walked down the corridor toward the docking bay. Near the junction, Saul, walking just behind the director, stylus in hand, already composing in his head the post-program internal review that would begin the moment we cleared the docking clamps. Glanced back at me once. His face was younger and more open than Veth's, practiced at composure in unexpected situations. What I saw in it, or thought I saw, was thus expression of someone who has been trained for a long time in a particular understanding of how a certain kind of work gets done, and by whom, and has just received a specific and documented demonstration that the category was larger than the training had assumed. Maybe I'm projecting. It was a quick glance down a corridor. We were already past him. The transport was in docking bay 7. Brandt loaded the secured files. Wren completed the departure manifest with the calm satisfaction of someone who has managed a complex operation without a single lost or misfiled item. Dr. Nurlanovna finished her final environmental log entry for Ring C. 32 days of data on the gap between the directorate's published standards and their operational practice in a jointly occupied facility, which she said, with genuine professional pleasure, support an excellent paper. Dr. Hamasaki sat in her seat in the composed faces, inward state of someone who has just finished the most significant professional experience of their career and is already composing the first of several publications that will eventually reshape a field. Tomas and Cressida were still talking, in the shorthand of people who have spent 3 weeks examining the same systems from different angles, and are now, for the first time, seeing the full picture of where their observations connect. I sat down and drank the last of Wren's tea. She had switched blends on the final day. Tomas said it was a commemorative impulse. I thought that was the right instinct. The docking clamps released. Vetharium fell away behind us, its lights making the ordinary geometry of an inhabited station receding into the ordinary dark. The report had already transmitted. 7 pages, 4 findings, 11 recommendations, full appendices, executive summary opening with its plain, honest first sentence. The Vethani Compliance Directorate is a professional, well-organized institution operating to high standards in most domains assessed. Specific areas in which targeted improvement would strengthen both methodological accuracy and the integrity of interspecies program relationships. I thought about what happened now. Veth would present the report to the directorate's senior staff. There would be a thorough review, a genuine one, because that was what the directorate did with assessments. They took them seriously, including the ones they hadn't requested, including the ones they hadn't known were coming, because the alternative was to treat their own professional standards as applicable to everyone except themselves. And that was not who they were. The charter revision would be drafted and documented and approved. Future joint program delegations, from whichever species, would arrive under a framework that required both parties to fully disclose their institutional mandates before the first session, transparent from the beginning, and the directorate would operate, for the rest of their institutional existence, with the knowledge that the provision had been used exactly once. Used correctly, under the Charter's own language, by a delegation of 7 that they had spent 3 weeks being gently and sincerely surprised about, I thought. About what the year of preparation had required before we arrived, the careful legal analysis of the Charter language, the long debates about methodology and ethics and what it meant to conduct this assessment well, rather than merely conduct it. The decision that if we were going to use the provision, we were going to use it in a way that the directorate itself would, on reflection, find impossible to fault. Fair, evidenced, precise, constructive, honest in both directions, about what they did well and about what needed work. A report that said what the evidence showed and stopped where the evidence stopped. The directorate assessed civilizations. What they had never been subjected to was being assessed. Not because no one was capable, because in 140 years, no visiting delegation had read the Charter's third appendix, with the particular preparation that Dr. Hamasaki had brought to it, arrived with the institutional mandate to act on what they found there, or perhaps both. The precise cause didn't especially matter. I thought about Avrisdan's 4 words, said in formal high register, said for the record. The delegation was thorough. In the Vethani professional tradition, thoroughness is the cardinal virtue. More than brilliance, more than speed, more than elegance of methodology. Thoroughness means you looked at what needed to be looked at. You documented what you found. You said what the evidence showed, and you stopped where the evidence stopped. It is the thing the directorate valued most in its own work. He had acknowledged it in ours. He had said it for the record because it was a fact, and facts went in the archive. Transit window appeared ahead. The compression shimmer of space-time that you stop noticing after the first few crossings, and then notice again, after long enough away. We slid through it, and the stars rearranged into the heading home. I looked at the 7 of us in the cabin. 7 people who had worn their thermal liners for 3 weeks in a cold ring with 2 malfunctioning heat panels, who had drunk their way through a considerable supply of tea, and who had built, one evening at a time, a document that said plainly and fairly what they had found. The document was already on a server at the directorate's home office, filed in the correct format, addressed to the correct office, routed through the channels the Charter specified, filed in all 3 archive formats, including the physical one, which would go into a sealed case with a small inset label on a shelf in that warm room that smelled of history, alongside the records of 140 years of assessments the directorate had conducted. It was the first one conducted on them. As Veth had said it himself in the 2nd week, as a compliment he meant entirely. Smaller delegations often compensated through a kind of intensity of attention. He had been right about the intensity, right about the attention, right about the compensation in the broadest possible sense. 7 was what we had sent. It had been enough. Transit home from Veth Orium took 11 days, station time. 11 days is a long time on a small transport with 7 people who have just finished 3 weeks of intensive work, and I want to say something about those days because they were part of the project in a way that mattered. First 2 days, everyone slept. Not continuously. They ate and moved around and had brief conversations, but in the way of people who have been at high output for a sustained period and have now been given permission to stop. Brant read, Dr. Nurlanovna organized her environmental data with the methodical pleasure of someone building a structure that has been waiting to be built. Wren went through the equipment manifest and the logistics records and found that everything was accounted for, and in order which she had expected, which she verified anyway. On the 3rd day, Tomas and Cressida started working again. This was their pattern. They could not, in practice, stop for very long when there was interesting material to think about, and the directorate's methodology data was interesting enough that the thinking started on its own. By the 4th day, Dr. Hamasaki had joined them, and the 3 of them were having long conversations about the architecture of the directorate's assessment framework. Not for the report. which was finished and transmitted. But because they were genuinely interested, because the directorate was genuinely interesting, because that kind of sustained intellectual engagement is what people with a certain kind of mind do when they have access to good material and sufficient time. I listened to these conversations when they overlapped with my own time. I did not contribute much. The report was done, and I found myself in the particular quiet that follows the completion of a long piece of work, where the mind is still moving but no longer driving, simply processing what it has accumulated. What I kept returning to was the question of what the directorate would do with the report, not what they would do with the findings. I was confident about that. They would review them seriously and take the actionable recommendations seriously and implement the ones they found well-founded. The recalibration issue would be addressed. The charter revision would happen. These were the kinds of findings that an institution of the directorate's professional culture handled correctly because they were the kinds of findings the directorate itself produced when it assessed others. And anything less than serious engagement with them would be a form of hypocrisy that the directorate's own values would not accommodate. What I kept returning to was the subtler question of how the report would change the directorate's relationship with joint programs going forward. Procedurally, I had already thought through the charter revision and its implications. But something more interior than that. The directorate had operated for 140 years as the assessors. The people who came to look, to evaluate, produced the definitive written account of what they had found. The civilizations they assessed were the subjects. Observed, documented, filed. This had been a stable asymmetry for as long as the institution had existed, and asymmetries that are stable for long enough start to feel like natural facts rather than contingent arrangements. The report changed that. Not dramatically. The directorate would still be the directorate, still running joint programs, still producing assessments of extraordinary scope and methodological sophistication. But there would now, permanently, be a piece of paper in their archives in which they were the subject. Filed under their own classification scheme, available in all 3 archive formats. Written by a delegation of 7 from a species they had described, 4,000 pages and 31 years in the making, as moderately interesting. I thought about whether this bothered me, the word moderately, and concluded that it didn't. It had been accurate. It was always going to be accurate, for the period it described. The report we had just filed didn't change what humanity had been in the years the directorate had been watching. It changed what the directorate knew about what they might have missed in the watching. Those are different things, and the difference matters. The Thurvai case study came back to me on day 6 of the transit, in the particular way that things come back when you've had enough sleep to let them settle. Is Anveth presenting it as a model of mature methodology, while the data Tomas had found made it, from a particular angle, an example of the calibration problem. Both things were true simultaneously. It was good work, and it had a gap in it, and the gap was only visible from a certain angle, and only if you had come looking for it. This was not unusual. It was in fact the defining condition of most institutional work, excellent in its own terms, with blind spots that are invisible from inside the terms, and visible from outside them. The directorate had spent 140 years looking at civilizations from outside their own terms. The report was what happened when something looked at the directorate from outside its terms. On day 8, Wren made a large pot of the commemorative tea blend and left it in the common area without comment. By the end of the day, the pot was empty. I think everyone understood what it was for. On day 11, we docked at the relay station and picked up our connecting transport home. Filing off the small transit vessel, carrying our cases, Dr. Hamasaki said quietly to me, not in Vethani which she could have used, but in plain straightforward terms that she was proud of the work. I said I was too. She said Overstan trusted us. I said, yes, I think he did. She said, I think we deserved that. I didn't say anything, because there was nothing to add that improved on it. We boarded the connecting transport. The relay station fell away behind us. Ahead was home. The moderately interesting species had turned out to be more interesting than that. Nobody needed to say so. It was already in the document, in plain language with full evidentiary support, filed correctly and permanently. That was, in fact, the Vithani way of doing things. We had learned it from them.